Chicago Tylenol Murders, Part 2. In one day, 6 people were dead. A last victim died 2 days later from cyanide-laced Tylenol capsules in late September of 1982. America and the world were totally fucking terrified. The way that Johnson & Johnson responded to this crisis was so great that today it is taught in public relations, marketing, and business classes everywhere as an example of how to handle a public relations nightmare. Johnson & Johnson by now knew that they were not responsible, but they knew the public would not respond well to that statement. So what could they say to save face and get through this? Well, deciding what to do and how to go forward, not really wanting to recall all the Tylenol, Chicago's Mayor Jane Byrne on October 1st held her press conference demanding for a recall. So J&J answered with a recall of all Tylenol in the Chicago area. J&J were now happy having taken some kind of action, but within a week of the deaths they were forced to recall all the Tylenol across the US due to how high of a profile the case had become. The recall cost the company about $100 million at the time, and they promptly destroyed all the 30 million pills collected. As a result of their actions, J&J was awarded the Silver Anvil Award for how to handle a crisis, presented to them by the Public Relations Society of America. Yes, that's a real thing, I looked it up. McNeil Consumer Products, the subsidiary of J&J, offered a reward that has never been claimed, which positioned the company as a victim in the positioning virus perpetrator, making the public sympathize with them. This is genius. Product design changes. The old design was proved to have many flaws. The box was easily opened and reclosed. The bottle was easy to pop open with your thumb. There was only a piece of cotton at the top and then you get to the capsules. That easy. The new design has the box glued shut, plastic wrap around the outer cap that must be removed, and then under the cap foil was put over the mouth of the bottle. All these changes made it very evident if someone has tampered with the product. After the nationwide recall, the new design was rushed out, landing on the shelves just 6 weeks later. In the beginning of '83, a newly designed pill was implemented, also called a caplet. This was a tablet that was coated in gel, making it easy to swallow, and restoring these steps helped to restore the public's faith in the Tylenol brand. J&J went even further by having the CEO, Howard Johnson, become the public face for the company, doing commercials and interviews with Ted Koppel, Dan Rather, and even going on shows like 60 Minutes. That same year, Congress passed the Tylenol bill, making product tampering a federal offense. In '89, the FDA new guidelines making it mandatory for all products manufactured to be in tamper-proof packaging. The suspect profile. Having this be such a landmark policy-changing case, what today we call profiles were called in to give a psychological assessment of potential suspect. The profile that was created was that the suspect was probably a male in his 20s or 30s, a Jekyll and Hyde type, full of self-doubt and low self-worth. This profile yielded lots of suspects, but it quickly became evident that it was going to be almost impossible to apprehend. 1,200 were received and followed up on. 20,000 suspects were looked into and finally getting down to 400. When established, the task force had 140 people on it. By the end of October '82, there were only 40 remaining. And by the end of the year, there were only 20 people left on the task force. There were no debit or credit cards making a paper trail, or no security cameras making it so hard to zero in on a suspect with no real motive evident. The suspects. Roger Arnold, 49, was one of the first people named in connection with the murders. He was a DIY chemist. He worked as a dockhand at a Chicago area warehouse within the 50-mile radius. His house was searched and investigators found books on explosives and poisons, as well as a copy of The Poor Man's James Bond. This book explains how to make potassium cyanide, and lab supplies, 5 unregistered guns, admitted to have had cyanide, but getting rid of it about 6 months prior. His wife had been admitted to Central DuPage Hospital and even told police investigators she had taken Tylenol and threw up after, but it was probably due to overheating because it only happened that once. Was he testing it out on his wife? He was eventually cleared as a suspect. About 6 months after being cleared, Arnold was arrested on murder charges. On June 17, 1983, Arnold had gone to a bar called Lily's to kill the bartender Marty Sinclair, who he believed had turned him in as the poisoner. He mistook John Stanicia, 46, a patron of the bar, as Sinclair, shooting him point blank. Stanicia is commonly thought to be considered to be an honorary 8th victim of the Tylenol murders. Arnold was sentenced to 30 years for the murder, serving 15 years, being released in 1999 and dying about 10 years later. James Lewis is considered a prime suspect in the murders. He wrote letters to J&J, to then-President Ronald Reagan, and one to the Chicago Tribune. The letter to Johnson & Johnson said basically, "I spent $50 and spent 10 minutes per bottle and killed 7 people. I see no reason to stop. Give me $1 million and I will stop." A bank account number was included. The letter had a New York postmark and had a Chicago area bank account number. The bank account had belonged to a travel agency owned by Frederick Miller McCahey. Frederick told police that he had closed the account and had not sent the letter, though he did not know who had. Robert Richardson, the husband of a former employee, Nancy Richardson. When the travel agency closed, Nancy lost her job and never received her last paycheck. McCahey went on to say that Robert was a person who would fixate and try to frame him in retaliation for not giving Nancy a last paycheck. Investigators found out that Robert and Nancy were aliases for James and Leghand Lewis. I will refer to Lewis as James and Leghand going forward. James wanted in Kansas City by the USPS for credit card fraud and had been indicted for murder in '78. When human remains were found in bags in the attic, he was let go because the bags were found during an illegal search. In December of '81, the Lewis fled Kansas City because the postal inspectors were closing in on them. They moved to Chicago and changed their names. James got a job as a tax preparer, but was soon fired after having an angry outburst at co-workers. Leghand was hired by the travel agency, but eventually the agency went belly up and she lost her job without getting her last paycheck. After this, the Lewis moved to New York, right before the Tylenol poisoning happened. In fact, it was the same month. Cyanide has a very short shelf life, and the earliest that the tainted bottles were put on shelves would have been September 28th. As hard as they tried, investigators couldn't place either spouse in the Chicago area that day. James had admitted to writing the letter to J&J, not the poisonings, and has never changed his story. When interviewed by police, he was asked how he would have tampered with the Tylenol. He was able to talk to them through the process step by step. "I have no clue," is the answer. But as OJ did, he hypothetically admitted to being guilty. He was loving the recognition and notoriety, having the investigators searching for him, using the time they were searching to call TV and radio shows. James was apprehended at the New York Public Library, copying the names and addresses of different newspapers. I guess he was planning to send more letters Zodiac style. Upon arrest, he is sentenced to 10 years for extortion and 10 years for the credit card fraud to be served consecutively. He served a total of 13 years and lives in the Boston area. The FBI has reopened the case again and raided the Lewis home, requesting fingerprints and DNA from James and Leghand. They fought it and lost, having to provide fingerprints and DNA. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, also had his DNA taken, though he had lived in Chicago. He was never really a suspect. Detective Scott Winkleman has worked the case and thinks that it is solvable. Today in 23, it is thought that the evidence in the case is circumstantial but charitable, meaning that James Lewis may be going on trial for the Tylenol murders. Monica Janis, the niece of victims Adam Stanley and Teresa Janis, has recently come out saying that her family has never gotten over the loss. Michelle Rossum, Mary Reiner's daughter, dedicated her to investigating the murders, doesn't agree with the mad poisoner theory. She thinks it happened in the convoluted supply chain and J&J covered it up. They used the countrywide recall and destruction to support his theory. In support of the mad poisoner, in '85, a woman in New York, Diane Elsroth, died after taking 2 extra-strength Tylenol. Her cause of death was ruled as cyanide poisoning. The cyanide was not from the Chicago '82 batch, but they found another bottle at the store Ellsworth bought her bottle at that was tainted with cyanide from the 82 batch. This death happened after the tamper-proof packaging. So was it indeed an inside job? The packaging appeared to be untampered with. 5 days later, New York State banned capsules. Scott Bartz, a former J&J employee, wrote a self-published book in 2011 on the Tylenol Murders, stating that the supply chain is so convoluted that the Tylenol could have been contaminated at any point along the way. Johnson & Johnson knew where it happened and covered it up.